Thank you. Wow. Thank you very much for that splendid introduction. It just shows you can be a troublemaker and still get something done in your life. That was fantastic. I want to start by thanking Dr. Faulkner and Dinah Tita for their generosity and kindness, goodwill, and efficiency in making this such a splendid trip and giving me an opportunity to interact with, have dialogue with many students and faculty, which has been a really, really precious thing for me. I feel very welcomed back to Bowling Green. This is my first visit since 1971. That's a long time away. And I noted with great interest the renovation of South Hall, where I had my office on the second floor for the years that I was here, and took many, many classes and had many great memories. I've been working on something recently called place memory, which is when you visit a place that has special symbolic significance in your life and you go back there and suddenly you start remembering things that you long ago had forgotten. And it's just been really wonderful. I am now approaching what most people would consider the last days of my working life, or toward the end anyway. And I'm more aware than ever of the privilege that I've had to get paid, to read and write and teach bright young people, and even some who aren't so bright or aren't so young. That's been a real treasure, a privilege, and an honor. And like many of you out there in the audience today who may be thinking about yourself as I talk about some things about myself, I was once sitting in your seat, well, not in this building, but in a seat like it, with a lot of insecurity about who I was and what I might become, about the kind of insecurity that we sometimes breed in the academy. And I was asking myself the question, where do I belong in this world? I think it's a question that most, if not all, graduate students and young faculty too ask. I would like to begin my talk today with a few memories of my days at Bowling Green, in particular my relationship to my mentor, Raymond Tucker. And then I want to talk a little bit about some lessons to be drawn about academic socialization, which is a core theme of my book, Paradigm Change. And I think most people have received a little handout, which I'll probably run through pretty quickly, and I'd be glad to interact with people more about it later. And then I want to talk some about the rise of autoethnography, why autoethnography has such currency right now in the human sciences, what nerves it has touched, both the nerves of those who resist it and those who embrace it, and how autoethnography may function to help us feel the sufferings of others. And I really want to emphasize feeling, because the kind of truth that I see in autoethnography is a feeling kind of truth. It was something that was never introduced to me as a graduate student. The word feeling didn't really fit in the same sentence as truth when I was learning epistemology and scientific method. The rise of autoethnography has a lot to do with a period of time in the 1980s and early 1990s when people were increasingly losing faith in master narratives, master ideologies, and imagining new relations between self and community. Let me start though with an obituary that I wrote for CRTNet, CritNet, the NCA website, upon learning of the death of my mentor. Raymond K. Tucker, mentor and friend. Today I grieve a deeply personal loss. Ray Tucker was my doctoral advisor and a dear friend. He was an inspirational teacher, by far the best classroom teacher I've ever known. Funny, eloquent, energetic, evocative. He gave stimulating, passionate lectures that kept you thinking about issues late into the night and long after class was over. Also, he had that special gift of acknowledgement. He knew how to validate every student. When he asked a question, just about every hand would go up. He found a way to engage every comment. You always knew he heard you. His courses weren't classes, they were events. The night I attended the first session of his communication theory course, my first course at Bowling Green, changed the course of my life. He turned a switch and the light went on. Ray Tucker was way ahead of his time. When I arrived at Bowling Green in 1969, Ray had just completed a sabbatical at Harvard, where he'd been introduced to cybernetics, systems theory, and child psychology. He immediately imported what he'd learned into his courses. In my first year at Bowling Green, he assigned books and articles by Gregory Bateson, Paul Václavic, George Mead, Margaret Mead, R.D. Lang, Irving Goffman, Martin Buber, Viktor Frankl, Paul Tillich, George Kelly, Rollo May, Kenneth Bowling, and those are only the ones I remember. Jerome Bruner also was on that list. His reading lists were staggering, as were my photocopying bills. I sit here now beside a whole file of cabinet of Tucker readings and notes that's still in my office. During my 2.5 years at Bowling Green, he taught seminars in cybernetics and general systems theory, family communication, communication and mental health, and therapeutic communication. I doubt that you could get these courses anywhere else in the country, not at that time, or even today. Ray was drawn to existential, phenomenological issues. He argued persuasively that the core of communication was meaning-making and the values into which we are socialized and indoctrinated by and through communication. Often he expressed deep concern about strategic communication and the consequences of our obsession with metaphors of power and control. Familiar topic these days, too. He gave compelling critiques of, quote, Man the Manipulator and Games People Play, two very popular books at that time. Our work is demanding because we have to know something about psychology, anthropology, history, philosophy, political science, sociology, and so on, he told us. We can't afford to isolate ourselves from the knowledge about communication that is out there in other fields. Ray had a deep attachment to humanistic psychology and spiritual health. Yet he also was completely committed to an empiricist orientation to research. He was yin and yang in many ways. He had studied with Donald Campbell at Northwestern, one of the giants of evolutionary philosophy and social science methodology. Ray was convinced that communication would gain the stature it deserved mainly through rigorous experimental or field research. He pioneered the introduction of multivariate statistical analysis in communication, and he insisted that his students conduct rigorous and controlled experiments for their dissertations. I suspect I was a bit of a disappointment to him when I turned my attention to interpretive social science, narrative, and autoethnography. Well, actually, it was ethnography then. He may never have fully grasped the profound influence he had on me and dozens of other Bowling Green students who were privileged to study in his presence. As a mentor, Ray expressed his view that, quote, "Our relationship will last a lifetime." At our very first meeting, he asked me, "What do you care about?" Then he added, "You see, you have to study something that's important to you." Often he would remark, "Remember, Art, being a professor is not a career. It's not a job. It's a way of life. It's something you love. Treat it with the same respect you give to the people you love." I recall a down period in my graduate program. Ray came to visit me in the hospital after my operation. He noticed how I was moping around, feeling sorry for myself. He politely told me to get my ass out of bed and get back to work. "I have a manuscript I just finished," he said. "I want you to read it and give me some feedback before I send it off to a journal." He knew I needed to get my mind off my illness, and he lovingly gave me just the push I needed. Ray held office hours 2 days a week. If you didn't want to wait in a long line, you'd have to get there early. He didn't make appointments, but he also didn't rush you out. He would listen intently, like a good therapist, and he would engage every idea or thought you brought up. At first, I have to admit, I found him intimidating. Later, our meetings felt like conversations between good friends. I learned almost as much in his office as I did in his classroom. I can't begin to express what an important role Ray Tucker played in my life. He wasn't a person who needed to be in the limelight. Otherwise, I'm sure everyone in our field would have known of him. He preferred to do the work of the great teacher silently, in the office, in the classroom, down in the lecture hall, on the dissertation draft, and by keeping conversation going. He gave many of us precisely the self-respect and motivation we needed. My last message from Ray arrived in May 2007. He told me about the wonderful experience he'd had recently giving workshops for police departments in Ireland and Alaska at the age of 81. He went on to discuss a recent article of mine he'd read and to share memories evoked by my piece. His death ended his life, but it did not end our relationship, which will continue in the cherished memories I keep alive. Within me and within the stories about him I share with others. Thank you for allowing me to share that with you. Now, I want to talk about a few things. I prepared a very formal talk, and then as I've met you all during the last couple of days, I decided this morning to, I was talking last night with some students about the fact that as a writer, you often have to give up your darlings when you're doing new drafts. And so I decided to give up my darling, the very formal lecture that I had prepared, and talk to you a little more from my heart and more casually, so that we might have a conversation, and so that you won't feel when I'm done like you're somehow been bullied into a perspective or intimidated, and maybe we can have just an ordinary conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about how I see, after 45 years of teaching and mentoring and writing, how I see somewhat how I see communication as a discipline, as a field, the place of autoethnography within that, how I look at graduate education many graduate mentors in this audience, as well as graduate students in this audience. So we can't help as graduate mentors to do things to students, to shape, to mold, to socialize, what effects that has, and how it might affect you as a student, as it did me when I left Bowling Green, and suddenly I was not surrounded by all the other students who were working on dissertations. I was by myself in a very different environment on my first academic position, and some of that I write about in the book. And then the whole issue of risk-taking, because I think most people who know me and who knew me when I was a quantitative researcher, you know, churning out quantitative studies, and then made a very radical shift, and I want to give you some of the reasons for that radical shift. And I think all, you know, on both sides, those who abandoned me after I left their field, and those who welcomed me when I developed a new academic, a somewhat new academic identity, a paradigm shift, as I sometimes call it, would all say there were risks. I took some risks. And it's hard to take risks in the academic world. It's hard to be true to yourself in many respects. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So when I think about communication, I think about a phrase that I ran across one time in a book by Jerome Bruner, Acts of Meaning, in which he talked about putting meanings in motion, and he was writing about narrative and stories. And it struck me at the time that this was something very, very important. That what we may have a special gift of in communication studies is a project that would be aimed toward putting meanings in motion. And that's what stories do. And that's a lot of what autoethnography tries to do. Because when it's in motion, it keeps moving. It doesn't sit still. And what I had been trained to do as a researcher was something within what used to be called the received view of knowledge, which is very static. It's about stability. It's not ordinarily about change. It doesn't move. So I think communication is not only what we study, but how we study. How do we study? One of the first things that Raymond Tucker introduced me to in his communication theory class back in 1968 were the symbolic interactionists. And he went through a list of sort of premises of symbolic interaction, and what he said was, and this was basic to his idea of communication, was we live in a physical world, but we also live in a symbolic world. And the symbolic world is the world of meanings. And that's very important. Meanings and values. Again, I had learned social science as being value-free. So how does that go together? We're supposed to have a value-free scientific investigation, but we're living in the world of communication, which is never value-free. It always has ideals and ideologies. So, so that became something that sat with me for a lot of years as I, ground out all these quantitative studies. What we, now, when it comes to graduate education, and I can say this in retrospect, and maybe I shouldn't say this with so many graduate students present, or graduate mentors present who might want to lynch me after this session, but I want to say that, and I don't really think this is a bad thing. I think to some extent it's a necessary thing, but it's one of those like necessary evils, that what we teach and learn in graduate programs is a great deal of conformity. we are socializing students into conformity. Now, when I say it's not entirely a bad thing, because that's part of being prepared. It's no different than when parents are charged with the responsibility of socializing their children, preparing them for the world. So most of us come out of graduate school having been, to some extent, well, you can use the polite word, socially constructed, or you can, use some other word like indoctrinated. Now, the other thing we teach, though, which is very important, and I think almost everyone in this audience ought to ascribe to it, is, at all levels of education, we're trying to get people to be critical. So we teach and we learn how to be critical. And one of the things I want to say about that is, where is that criticism directed? And I'll get to that in a few minutes. If we do our jobs, our graduate students are prepared to enter the academy. They will think of themselves ordinarily as teachers and especially as researchers, especially these days. They will know the rules, what they have to do. And that's who I was in 1971 when I left Bowling Green. I had been well socialized. I knew the rules, I knew the methodologies, I had been well trained, I was good at it, and it burned inside of me. I was burning up with energy to produce and to be successful and to do a good job. And that continued for about 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And then something happened. I had a major life crisis. My life, and when I teach narrative and also autoethnography, and I mentioned this in one of the classes yesterday, I teach about interruption, that our lives, I have a friend, Michael Hyde, wonderful scholar, philosopher of communication, who talks about life being just a series of interruptions. We make plans and then something happens. Joseph Heller wrote a famous novel in the 1960s or 50s called Something Happened. And you never know, even when you get to the end, you keep turning the page, thinking he's going to tell you what happened. You never know what happened. The end of the book, very disappointing. But what happened, and I want to read a little passage from my book about this. What happened was I was married during graduate school and after, and we had gone through school. We had met at Syracuse, and we had gone through school, and my wife, very much supported me while I was in graduate school, and we went out together to Cleveland. My first position was at Cleveland State, and she had, and I talk about this in the book, she had had a father who was a journalist, war correspondent during the Second World War. And he came home very damaged by it. And these were the days when people got into trouble, they gave them lobotomies often. And so she had grown up with a father who had had one of those surgeries. And I didn't know much about real life psychology, and in those days very few people knew much about depression. But I woke up one day and discovered that I was living with someone who I didn't know, literally, who reacted to me as if I were her father rather than her partner. I was scared to death. I had no idea what was going on. I just knew things were changing and changing fast, and I needed help, and of course she needed help. And I tell this story in a chapter that I titled Dark Side of the Moon, after the Pink Floyd album. And here's how I'm not going to tell you all the details of her illness and my response to her illness, but I do want to show you how I represented it. And these are experiences, when we talk about autoethnography, we're talking about loss, we're talking about change often, we're talking about emotional life and things we're not prepared for, things that interrupt our life often. And we try to represent it in ways that will bring people closer to the experience, not push them away, bring them closer. And sometimes we speak in metaphors. And here's how I represented how I recall feeling during that period and what lesson might have been in it. And this first little passage is called Lost. Your life rolls along smoothly. It makes sense. You are moving ahead. The forward momentum feels good. You don't question it. The paradigm is working. It gives you the illusion of predictability and permanence. One chapter foretells the next. The story is sufficiently familiar to feel secure, sufficiently puzzling to hold interest. You think you know the plot and have a notion where it's leading. Some days you feel as if you've been here before. Other days you feel as if you're making it all up as you go along. Neither feels threatening to you. There has to be a little mystery in every story, you tell yourself. Go with the flow. There, far off in the distance, you catch a glimpse of an ending toward which your story is pointing. But you're in no hurry to finish. The ride is more important than the destination. You don't want to miss anything on the way. You expect a few bumps along the road, but you've done your homework. You have a map. You're prepared. Then, one day, an anomaly appears out of the blue. You come to a place that isn't on the map. You can turn left or right or continue straight ahead. You don't know which way to turn. You look behind you, and all you see is thick, dense fog. The road back home disappears from view, vanished, gone. It's nowhere to be found. You turn back and gaze ahead. Which path do I take? You hesitate, unsure. Each path is a different story leading you in a different direction. But there are no signposts. There is nobody to guide you, no book or map to show the way. Fear and doubt engulf you. You feel lost and scared. Darkness moves in. You hear the sounds of nocturnal creatures approaching. You can't stay put. You must decide. Deciding. One of my claims is that life is lived in decisions. Yesterday in one of the classes, I quoted Sartre, the famous existential philosopher, existentialist, who said that freedom is a burden. It's a burden because it opens up so many choices to you. What are you going to choose? And so in the next paragraph, I write a section which I call, Am I Dreaming? And see if you've ever felt this in a particular crisis that you had to go through in your life. If I had become a stranger to Brenda, who had she become to me? How can I express what it feels like to wake up beside someone you've slept with every night for 5 years, a person with whom you've planned a life course, revealed your past, plotted your future, shared your history and your destiny, released your pain and pleasure, disclosed your dreams and fears, opened your heart and mind, trusted with your secrets and your fantasies, confided in, explored with, banked on, and not know that person, feel as if she is a stranger, as if the two of you had no shared past. How can I tell you what it feels like to one day be a husband and a partner, and the next day be a father and a caregiver to the same person? You're 28 years old. You have most of your adult life ahead of you when suddenly, with little warning, A tidal wave of fate sweeps into the harbor of your consciousness, taking your breath away, jolting your frames of reference, ripping away your moorings, carrying your anchor out to sea. Suddenly, life's impermanence reveals itself. What can you really count on? Everything feels uncertain, undependable, unreliable. At a moment like this, when you're overcome with confusion, despair, and dread, you can lose your bearings. You begin to doubt your grasp on reality. Is this real? Is it a dream, a bad dream, a nightmare? As soon as you wake up, everything's going to be back to normal. You'll see. Can I please wake up now? So, that was a representation of some of what was going through me at the time. And then I had my life as a professor to deal with at the same time. Suddenly, preparing surveys to hand out to undergraduates in freshman public speaking didn't seem all that important, to be honest about it. And one reviewer of my book wrote on Amazon.com in one of those little, reviews, that he thought that at this particular point in the book, I had showed that I confessed that I no longer loved what I was doing. In fact, I didn't even like it. And now what do you do? Okay? Especially when you have already an identity and people respond to you in certain ways and you're getting letters and invitations and this and that. And it's not you. You don't feel authentic, right? So something happened, and we moved into the 1980s, and this was a time with a lot of change. A lot of change. Postmodernism was getting a lot more play. And I want to turn for a minute, because I think it's a good transition moment between the moments of this talk, to just take a quick look at that chart. Because just like my personal life had undergone a paradigm change, so I was being welcomed in. Can you hear me? Here, okay. So I was being welcomed in to change on another level. And that was the level of my life in school, my life as a professor. I was very fortunate. I had gone to a very good high school. I was always in like advanced placement English, and I liked to write. But mostly I was writing traditional social science. And I'm going to talk about writing traditional science and social science in a few minutes. But here, there's a left and a right here side. And I do not want these to be seen necessarily as oppositions. One is not against the other. One is not standing in opposition to another. One of the things that I appreciated about Richard Rorty's work on language and epistemology, and I've cited this quote a number of times in a number of pieces, these are not issues to be resolved. They are differences to be lived with. Okay? So you're probably pretty familiar, especially if you do quantitative research in the empiricist or post-positivist tradition, with the right side of this. And then what I've tried to do is to look at terms that are in the same ballpark on the left side. So those who do work on the right side usually refer to themselves as social scientists. I prefer the term the human sciences, because very often what we find in the social science theory, we don't find any people. We don't find any human beings. In fact, as the social psychologist Michael Billig said in a recent book he wrote on writing in the social sciences, which he titled, "Learn to Write Badly, How to Succeed in the Social Sciences." Okay, learn to write badly. That there are no people. He says there's nobody moving around, there's no breath in it, there's no life in it, and especially there's no people. We turn people into objects. Just as we turn, I've never understood, in retrospect, a lot of communication empirical research because communication is not an object. As soon as we start objectifying it, it's not communication anymore. It's stopped. It's not moving. Okay, so we have qualitative and quantitative. A lot of you want to study social change or even resistance and that kind of thing under the human sciences paradigm. And then there's positivist and post-positivist. And then there's narrative truth. That's a kind of truth that interpretivists like me are seeking. The truth of stories. And that's truth, and later on I have a few lines further down, truth as a region or as a place to dwell. Mark Freeman has written about this. He's a psychologist at Holy Cross. Wonderful idea, I think. We dwell there for a while. We insert ourselves into that region. Versus truth as a thing. Is truth something to be discovered like it's under a rock and we can find the object. Pragmatism. My main concern is the usefulness of our research. Who can use it? What can they do with it? Okay. Now I've heard other colleagues of mine, and even in tenure review meetings, talking about, well, I don't know about this research that so-and-so does because it's not building any theory. Really? Do you mean it's not useful? Because I think it's very useful. We talk about specific pieces here. Okay. When did we say that building theory, who decided that? Who decided that that's the primary thing that researchers or critics or anybody else needs to be doing? How about making a difference in people's lives? Isn't that important? Coping versus representing. Research becomes useful when it helps people cope with the conditions of their life. When Carolyn Ellis, my partner, published Final Negotiations, a story of her caregiving for 10 years with a man who became her husband in the last couple weeks of his life, who had emphysema. In the conclusion of that book, rather than tell you how it relates to all the other social sciences theories of caregiving, she says, what I've tried to do here is to offer some companionship to some of you who will have an experience like this. It won't be identical to me, It won't be identical, but you will be looking for a friend. You will be looking for companionship. And I hope that you can find that in what I've given you here in this story. We want to keep conversation going. We don't want to stop conversation, which sometimes happens with received knowledge. The researcher left out of so much research. The first question I asked, in fact, I asked this on one of the panels this morning, I asked each person to talk about, how did you come to this topic? Because it wasn't even mentioned. They just went into their research report. What brought you to this? Why did you think this was important? What meaning does it have to you in your life? Okay. And so the researcher is a presence. There's nothing you can do to eliminate all the presence, all the bias, quote, in quotes, of the researcher. It's an illusion to think that you can. No matter how you control factors, you are deciding the questions that get asked. You are. You are deciding, you know, how the variables are manipulated or any of that stuff. Okay? Then what's especially important when we get to autoethnography especially is vulnerability, capacity for vulnerability. Many of us experience heartbreaking things in our lives. Why should those be left out of communication research, family research, etc.? You know, Ruth Behar, the anthropologist who wrote a wonderful book titled The Vulnerable Observer, says in the conclusion of the book, people may call me Victorian and sentimental, she said, but you know what? I don't want to do research that doesn't break my heart. You know, that's what I want to do. And certainly we need to have some of that. Okay, so you can go through the rest of these, and you're probably familiar with some of these distinctions. I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. And so what I want to talk about was some of the changes then that were happening as we now had a choice. We now at least had a choice that didn't exist to me as a graduate student. I can do a kind of research in which I embrace subjectivity, I embrace emotionality, I put myself in the research. That's a choice. If it doesn't appeal to you, fine. But you know what was happening in the late 1980s? When I was at Bowling Green as a student, 2 out of 24 students were white females. There were no people of color in the graduate program, none. There were no people from other countries in the graduate program, none. There were no women on the faculty. And I'm not saying this in a critical, condemning way. That's, you know, as Walter Cronkite used to say, that's the way it was, right? But beginning, you know, as we moved into the 1980s, things began to change. You know, we started admitting more women to universities, more women to graduate programs, more people of color, more diversity, and so forth. And many of these people sat in our classes and listened to communication theory and psychology and other things and say, I'm sorry, this doesn't represent me. You know, I don't fault you for like doing it, but it doesn't move me. I'm not in it. It's not my story. Give me something else. Let me tell you what my life is like. So that had a big impact. And in 1990, I met Carolyn Ellis. I met her at a lecture that she gave. And this was a very interesting lecture, and I talk about our meeting in the book. And it was a lecture she was giving in the business college, of all places. I'd never met her. We'd been on the same campus for 6 years. And we had just started our PhD program, and I grabbed her, not her, I grabbed some students, and I said, let's go listen to this talk. It really sounds interesting. And it was titled Systematic Sociological Introspection and Lived Experience. Wow, you know, nice title. I had no idea what any of it meant. I think I knew what introspection was, but that had been rolled out of psychology 50 years earlier. So we went to this talk, and she started talking, and the first 10 minutes of her talk was just defending the stories that she wanted to tell as being legitimately scientific through introspection. And then the rest of her talk, she told the stories, and she absolutely blew me away, right? I was there. I could feel it. And I thought to myself, and I whispered to 2 things to the student. The first thing I whispered, although I'm probably using the term today, I said, you know, I wanted to high five, you know. Yes, somebody is doing this stuff. And then the other thing I whispered was, she's giving my lecture. How dare her, you know? How dare her? And then, of course, she was talking about her now dead, deceased husband, and she was very cute, very good looking. Very attractive and full of energy, and I was like totally, you know, my mind was turned on, my body was turned on, everything was clicking, you know. I've got to meet her. So, you know, as soon as she finished dancing across the floor as she was doing, I said, I raised my hand, you know, and I asked her a couple of what I thought, you know, would at least provoke her questions about why she was so defensive in the beginning of her talk when her stories were so powerful and evocative. Later on she said, well, nobody's ever asked me a question like that. They're always asking me to defend this as being legitimate work. And so I asked her another question, and then, then I gave up my place as a questioner. But at least now I knew that I could go up and apologize after the talk. So we could get to know, and I waited till the crowd around her was gone, and so the rest is history. But one of the things a few weeks ago, then we had academic courtship. So what do academics do when they're courting? A few days later, 2 days later, I went to my mailbox, and there was a stack of her publications. So then I sent one of the graduate student who was working with me. I said, go over to Sociologies and stick these in her mailbox, So, and then a week or two later, she invited me to her house to have a meeting, and we talked, for several hours. And the conversation, as I remember it, is in the book. And one of the things we talked about was like plotting something different, something new. I was a full professor. I'd been chair of my department. We had a new graduate program. She was doing really exciting stuff. And I said, I think there are people out there who are going to just really want to do this. And she resisted it at first. It's like, well, you're pie in the sky. You think everything is possible. When you're in love, you think anything is possible, right? So we talked about what we could do together, and one thing led to another. And that was 1990. We wrote a couple of stories together, created something that was called co-constructed narrative. We weren't using the word autoethnography. That didn't come along until she just almost in passing in a 1998 piece mentioned the term autoethnography. And then Norman Denzin asked us to write this piece that was in the handbook, second edition of the Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry. When we wrote that piece, we could not find more than 25 or 28, something like that, articles or chapters or books that ever had even used the term autoethnography. And everyone that was using it meant something different than what we thought it could mean. Okay? They meant it sort of as indigenous ethnography, when a native community writes about itself. Okay? But we thought it could be much broader. And then we held a conference through the Society for the Study of Symbolic Interaction, and we invited performers, and we invited some new qualitative people, and Norman and Kenneth Gergen, who was doing social construction, and a whole bunch of people to the beach in Florida. And we had this conference, which produced a later book, and we had already done composing ethnography. Well, long story short, I looked up the other day in preparation for this talk, autoethnography. And some of our fiercest critics are still claiming here 16 years later that this is a passing fad. It's going to go away, and we're going to get back to business as usual, right? Well, take those 28 pieces that used autoethnography, but used it mainly as indigenous ethnography. Now, if you put the word autoethnography into Google Scholar, you come up with 20,000. Okay. That first book chapter, as of this morning, had something like 3,600 citations. We have been invited to do workshops on autoethnography and personal narrative in New Zealand and in all those places that she was kind enough to mention in the introduction. It's not going away. It touched something. I would be the last one to recommend that everybody get on the autoethnography bandwagon. That is not why I'm here or why I'm talking about it. Okay? This is not like a sales pitch. Please understand that. What it is to say is, what I am trying to say is, with people of color, with women, with LGBT, with all the diversity that we have in the world and in our lives in the university, that these stories, these autoethnographic stories, touch people. They identify with them. They're evocative. Now, I want to talk just for a minute, and then I want to, save some time too. I have one other, well, I don't know if I'm even going to read that other passage. But people still need to learn how to read autoethnography, because you can't read autoethnography like you read communication monographs. Okay, that's not the kind of reading that autoethnography invites you into. Okay. Students sometimes ask because I use a lot of stories. I use short stories. I use novels. I use all kinds of different stories when I teach. And students will say, well, Dr. Bochner, I'm not sure what I was supposed to get out of that story. And my standard response at this point is simply, you're asking the wrong question. This is not about what you should get out of the story, so the professor will answer the question. The question is, how do you get into it? Get into it. Good autoethnography pulls you into it. You almost have no choice. It touches something. It touches your heart. It touches your gut. You feel the truth. You feel the truth. Now, most of our education in research methods and so forth that's epistemological says, we're trying to know something as if we know only from our brains. Autoethnography is an embodied form. It's an embodied form. And I was very impressed with a book, and I mentioned this yesterday too, when I read it more than 10 years ago, Jane Tompkins, My Life in School, when she said she actually retired from the university early in her mid-50s because she was fed up. She said, faculty aren't talking to each other anymore. They don't know each other at all. They're just off in their entrepreneurial worlds. And she said, we're not doing a very good job of educating the whole person. The whole person. Now, for years, I taught family communication. And in family communication, I would ask the students to write stories about their families. And I wanted them to be aware that every family, no matter what, how good it is or how bad it is, passes down certain stories that usually, in one way or another, induces prejudice. Doesn't mean your parents aren't good people or anything like that. But these students would write, that was one of the assignments. Give me a story that was passed down to you that you now on reflection can look at that story and see ways in which prejudice is being passed on by the very stories that you were told in your household. And then those students would share those stories in class. And those stories, kids would cry, kids would laugh, kids would get angry. They would be embodied, their bodies were working. And they were learning something. They were learning something. I was persuaded of that, okay? So autoethnography, not just for research purposes, not just to write books and so forth, but also pedagogically, I know nothing more powerful. I know nothing more powerful. In my experience, okay? So now, finally, and I think I'll just skip that last part, and you can read it in the book for those of you who get the book or decide to read it. Writing. We had some talks about this. Many autoethnographers don't even necessarily first think of themselves as researchers. We think of ourselves as writers. And when you begin to think of yourself as a writer, you think about yourself differently. And I think that's really, really important. Because even if you're not doing autoethnography, if you're doing orthodox conventional social science, what is almost the first thing we tell our new graduate students? We tell them, in your lifetime, if you're going to be a professor anyway, you're going to have to write. You're going to have to publish or perish, okay? but there are very few graduate programs that I know of, only a few, that offer a course on writing. It's sort of assumed you can write. Why? Why is it assumed? This is a particular kind of writing. And one of the things Michael Billig says in his book is, when I was, and this is a guy now who's written 14 books, and he's one of the most famous social psychologists in the world. He said, when I was a graduate student and I was assigned these theory pieces in the first theory courses, I went home and I had a dictionary next to me. And, you know, my parents didn't talk this way. You know, my high school teachers didn't talk this way. You know, and there were all these new nouns. Every other word seemed to end in I-Z-A-T-I-O-N. And, you know, he says, now in retrospect, you know how I see that, he says? It's a form of bullying. You bully your reader into submission. Why? Because what we're really teaching is you have to sound smart. But you know what, he says? It wasn't that these people who wrote this way were so smart. It wasn't that at all. It was they didn't know how to be clear. And what a lot of these words did was it hides under this veneer of obscurity, making everybody say, well, why can't I figure this out? And everyone else is afraid to talk to their best friend who's sitting next to them, their cohort in graduate school, afraid to ask them whether they understand. Everyone's sitting in the classroom saying, I didn't know what the hell this was about, but I better act like I do, you know. How many times can I say hegemony in a sentence, you know? So this is, so the question becomes for a lot of young scholars, what are the words a young social scientist should use? You know, now we don't give a course like that. But as a matter of fact, as a reviewer of hundreds, if not thousands at this point after 45 years of manuscripts and book proposals and all this, I can tell you that clarity counts. Lucidity counts. And I want someone who you know, one of the other things that Billig says that I think is, actually it's very simple, but it's very profound. I mentioned this at lunch, is that easy writing leads to hard reading. Hard writing, where you really have to work at it and think about the other, and we in communication of all people should be aware of audience. Hard work, hard writing, whether it's poetic or prose forms, hard writing leads to easier reading and more accessible reading and more evocative quite often, okay? So what autoethnography doesn't do is it doesn't turn people into things. It doesn't do that. Our works are populated with people, okay? And they're populated with people who have gone through stuff. Now that's not to say, incidentally, and I've had many occasions, and I told some other people in conversations about this, where students will come to me and say, I want to write an autoethnography, and here's what's happening. I'm going through this certain thing, okay? I'm going through it, and I feel it, and I want to write about it, and so forth. And it always poses a bit of a dilemma to me, because I want to work with students who want to do this kind of work. But after I talk with them for a while, I find they're really in it. And phenomenologically speaking, if you're really in it's very hard to be in something and then stand apart from it and represent it in some way. Okay, so very often I discourage people. And I've come to the point, we talk a lot about lived experience. And Michael Hyde helped me in a conversation I had with him work through this. And I gave a talk down in Texas last year about this too, where I was talking about lived through experience. When you've lived through something, like I lived through that experience with Brenda, lived through experience means that you have lived through it, and now hopefully you've gained some wisdom about it and you can communicate it to other people. So all things being equal, which they never are, that tends to be what I prefer, that you've lived through it and now you have something to say about it. Now, two other things about autoethnography, and this is personal taste. Everybody has different tastes, but my personal taste, one of the things that really attracts me to prose form autoethnography especially, is something which I call human consciousness displayed on the page. Human consciousness displayed on the page. I want to see a writer who has worked through something and to see the marvel, I think it's marvelous, the marvel of somebody who has suffered sometimes or something, some dilemma, some terribly difficult decision, and worked their way through it somehow, survived it somehow, hopefully, and we get this marvelous, communicatively, performatively, we get this marvelous depiction of a human consciousness going through something. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The other thing, and I'll probably end here, the other thing is I like to think these days of autoethnography as the genre of doubt. That's another distinction with other forms of inquiry, which are valuable in their own right. This is not an against kind of a talk. The genre of doubt. I remember when I was doing a lot of work on interpersonal communication and relationships, and one of the favorite theories of everybody at that time, which I didn't quite understand, was Charles Berger's theory of uncertainty reduction. It was as if it was, when I started thinking about it, is, well, it's understandable that people want to reduce their uncertainty, but is that the goal of our lives? Because if it is, we're going to be very frustrated. Because we don't live lives that are very certain. Anything almost can happen at any time. And some of the best autoethnographies, I think, are not like resolutions, that everything gets tidied up and resolved and everybody lives happily ever after. But they make us aware of the uncertainty, of the things that can happen to people, and of the amazing strength that shows in human consciousness and relationships of how people deal with these things. My partner, Carolyn Ellis, has been studying a single Holocaust survivor for the last 7 years. He's 88 years old. You can find her film with him on YouTube. And she's now writing about something which she calls compassionate interviewing, a form of interviewing in which you form a relationship with the person you're interviewing. And he was one of the last people to get out of the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. And he went through a lot in his life, and he survived it, and he's now telling his stories. But by forming a relationship with him and listening to the stories that he recalls, and she traveled back to Poland with him. He hadn't been back to Warsaw for 70 years, and went back to the places that he remembered, including the little wall that's left from the wall of the ghetto. And she demonstrates how you know when you've been compassionate, how you might know. It's never certain. I think we need a lot more compassionate research that doesn't produce this sort of ideology of objectivity and distance and so forth. That's not to say there's not a place for that. It's simply that we need many forms, and this is one of those forms. So let me just conclude then. I had a longer passage, but I've been talking a long time. Near the end of the book, I have a section which is called Letting Go, which talks about my struggles of actually publishing this book. They wanted the book. It wasn't that thing. It was just that I didn't want to give it up. And that became a problem. But finally, the last section of this chapter titled Finishing Touches is titled In the Middle. Moments before he died, Tolstoy remarked, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Human beings are born not knowing, and we still don't know when we die. But between birth and death, we have to choose something to do. I chose the human sciences because I thought they could show me life as it really is lived. But I found that I wanted to do something more than merely receive the knowledge. I wanted to react to it, converse with it, and apply it. But the ruling paradigm encouraged replication, not conversation. Now I know that what I want to do is make people feel stuff. Continue my quest to put into circulation self-clarifying and transforming stories, and keep alive the conversation in the human sciences about what can make life good and just. That may not be what I'm supposed to do, but it does feel like the right thing to do. And I hope you'll join me. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm happy to take comments or questions or criticisms, any and all of the above. Yes, sir.
I'm a PhD student, and I took humanistic research methods with Dr. Bochner.
Lucky you, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And we read some of your early work, and then we read autoethnographies throughout over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded, and your talk reminded me of something Dr. Gonzalez once said. He said that after Bob Dylan wrote All Along the Watchtower, and Jimi Hendrix did a cover of it, he said he could never do his. Bob Dylan always had to do Jimi Hendrix version. I was wondering what are some of the autoethnographies you've read, and how, if they have helped you change your approach to autoethnography, how and why, and how that developed.
Well, that could lead to a very lengthy answer because it's a great question, and it's an important question. I'm always on the lookout, and I'm privileged to get a lot of people who send me autoethnographies they've done. In terms of particulars, there was a dissertation I directed by Tony Adams that was made into a book on coming out narratives, which has a lot of autoethnography in it, a lot of bold stories, and also develops, I think you can see what he's driving at through his own story, that coming out had been treated as sort of a one-time thing. You come out and then you're out, but that coming out is not a one-time thing for someone, for a gay or lesbian or many other people, and that he opened my eyes to a lot of things related to those struggles. There's a myriad of examples that I can give. There are a few that Lisa Tillman Healy has done on women and eating, on her own struggles with bulimia, and that go through her childhood experiences. Right now, we have a book coming out in our series on bullying. And
that's the Writing Life series,
yeah.
which Rutledge has taken over.
Yeah. And there's just a myriad of them. I'm always, the thing about autoethnography to me is that it puts me in other people's shoes. And I have to identify with it some way. And There are some that, there are some, and we have these discussions in my class all the time, because there'll be, a third of the class who say I was, just so moved and so into this and so forth. And then there'll be a few students who say, well, geez, I couldn't get into this, and then we'll have discussions about it. So it's not, it's not like there's one way to do it or one right thing here. There isn't. And then you learn a lot about the differences of how people read and how they open themselves up to being moved. That's another thing. There's just a myriad of issues like that. Right now, and I spoke in a class about this yesterday, I'm directing a dissertation by Nathan Hodges, who grew up in his father was a factory worker. His mother ended up being married 4 times, and she was a waitress, and then she became a drug addict. And he comes from, a very poor, white, rural community. And one of the interesting things he said, when he came into the graduate program, not only did he say, hey, I don't speak like any of these other academics, which was absolutely the truth, but I go to some of these classes where they're all talking about white privilege, and I understand white privilege, but my parents weren't privileged. And I don't know how to respond. I get angry, but I don't want to critique the professor. He might fail me or something. But I'm left out of all these stories. And see, I guess that would be another answer to this. I'm looking for stories that haven't been told as much as possible. Now, the other thing I didn't mention in this, I think one of the things that we miss a lot as academics is we live an institutional life in addition to our personal life. And a lot of stuff is going on in universities, and we yell and scream about it with each other. We battle over it and so forth. But it always seemed crazy to me, and that was the point I said I would come back to, but I never did, was that we're keeping a lot of secrets. We're keeping a lot of secrets. Do we want to? Is it a good thing that we're keeping these secrets? And it's a tough, it's an ethical question, it's a professional question, it's all of this stuff. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I talk about it in the first part of the book, is, I was struck by this little book that Dan Rose, an anthropologist who later retired way early. I mean, he went into organizational life, but it was called Living the Ethnographic Life. And he says in there, academics are critical about everything except their own institution. That's where the silence is. So that's another area of silence. That we live, we know more about it than anybody else. Some stranger would come in, from the, legislature or something. So yes, I'm looking for those. I'm looking for those stories. I'm looking for the stories that aren't told or haven't been told, or just I'm interested in human consciousness. So show me human consciousness on the page. Show me the process of going through something and making decisions that were difficult and contradictory and life-changing and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question concerning the criticisms of autoethnography. So
Sure.
I think you've done a great job of highlighting the uses and the utility of it. But when I first learned about it, I was told that one critique of it is that it can be self-indulgent and navel-gazing, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? What's your answer to that?
Well, if I read it and I think it's only about you, and it doesn't connect to me or others, then I think there's an issue there, and we need to look at that issue. But the best autoethnography, or even good autoethnography, doesn't do that. It is inviting. Autoethnography, there's an ethnography part of it. There's auto, yes. In fact, I often put up the terms. Auto, ethnography. writing, okay, culture, cultural, and auto, the I. So it has to have all three parts. I don't think you can read my book and say there's no ethnography in there. There's a whole heck of a lot of ethnography in there. A lot of it's written in the first person, but it's not exclusively. The passage I read to you today was written in the second person, not in the first person, which has its place. There's poetic autoethnography. There'll be someone on this campus, I think, next week who does some very interesting poetic autoethnography, Ron Pilius. I don't know where he's speaking. Do you know where he's speaking?
He's speaking at the Eva Marie Saint Theater in the Wolf Center for the
Okay.
Yeah, you know the time.
11 to 2 on Saturday.
Okay. So yeah, that would be my is it always a risk? Yes. A lot of times it's a cheap shot. You know, because people don't know, don't want to read it, or they want to be opposed to it. You know, for years, Paul Atkinson, who was one of, my critics, in fact, he just wrote a piece that said, Art Bochner and Carolyn Ellis are ruining sociology or something like that. I didn't know I was that important, or that powerful. Oh yeah, it's a lead piece. It was just a speech he gave somewhere, but they published it as the lead speech. I don't think he used the word ruin, but it was pretty much that's what he was saying. But for years he would just talk about personal narrative or autoethnography and not even cite any of the work, because he didn't want to see it like cited, I guess. I don't know. But there was this backstory to that nobody would know. Paul Atkinson was on the first panel the first time Carolyn and I performed an autoethnography at a sociology conference, and he was on the panel. He was the first speaker, and we were the last speaker, and they had given us 25 minutes to present a performance that was on what we titled The Constraints of Choice in Abortion, and it was a very emotional performance. And he, being a British sociologist, was appalled, And he even made a comment. He said, emotion has no place in sociology, only analysis. Well, if that's what you hold, if that's the position you hold, fine, Although I never understand, I did a lot of quantitative research. I worked hard. Doing good quantitative research is difficult. Okay? I chose to go a different route. I'm not going to stand here now and say we shouldn't do any of that stuff, right? There's room for a lot of different things. But, academics, I don't know what it is about academics, but they have to be opposed to anybody who's not doing their stuff, some of them, their stuff. Be careful of that, But I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know why people choose to live their lives that way. I don't want to live my life. The other thing I tell my graduate students, and I'm an old professor, so I get to say these things, right? Is surround yourself with positive people. Surround yourself with affirming people. Live your life. You're not on this planet that long, and it's fine. We need to be against injustice and all that stuff, and good autoethnography does that too. But I don't understand the compulsion for, being against some group of people who want to study something some way. Let's see what the work produces, right? Yes?
Dr. Bochner, I really like the part you said that we should feel and compassion of the writer and then the stories. So I am currently reading an autoethnography of a Chinese businesswoman. She is trying to portray herself as a minority living the American dream. But there are so many controversies about the truth or about if it's mythical writing, part of the writing in her stories. So
These are other people who are
yes,
saying it's
other
controversial?
People from mainland China, her neighbors, her childhood friends.
Okay.
So as a researcher, what do you suggest when we're dealing with these controversies?
Well, you know, I would have to read it and look at the voice of it. You know, what voice is it told in? And is it told in a voice that's trying to say, this is the only truth, this is the only interpretation that you could come to? Or, you know, how vivid is it in terms of her experience as it's represented on the page? And, you know, hopefully, you know, if it's about a particular culture or community or something like that, and that's another thing we didn't get to. We didn't get to ethics here, the ethical mandate. Autoethnography has a lot of ethical questions. The ethical questions are much more important to me than the indulgent, you know, self-indulgence question, because other people are represented in our stories. Now, if she's representing other people in her community, what did she do to invite them to talk back to her version of what happened? I think that's very important. I once wrote, with a couple of other people, a piece that was about something that happened at an academic conference where some scholar acted out and really was intimidating people and so forth. And I knew this guy, I'd known him for some years, and some therapist who was in the audience had actually taken notes because it got very emotional. And we decided, three of us, to write. I'm not sure I would even have called it an autoethnography. It was just like a depiction of what happened at this meeting. But I then sent it to him, you know, because he was not being portrayed very positively. And I sent it to him and I said, look, we've written this. There are a number of things we can do with it. We can, like, leave your name out, period. But also, I want to give you an opportunity to talk back to it. You know, that's the ethical thing to do for me. And if you decide to talk back to it, we're gonna put it in the story and send it back to you so that you're okay with the way you're represented. And there were lots of negotiations that happened after that. I won't go into all those details. Often in doctoral dissertations, things get even hairier because some students in a prospectus meeting will say, well, I'm interviewing these people and I'm going to write this as an ethnography or an autoethnography. But when I finish my dissertation, before I can defend it, I'm going to take it back to the community and show them, and I'll seek their approval. And I always like take a deep breath. You know, it's like, do you want your degree to depend on how the people that you are depicting in your dissertation feel about how you've represented them? I mean, after all, the other way to see this is that the researcher has a certain amount of accountability. You have accountability. So they are your interpretations. I try to make it clear that, you know, these are my interpretations. Other people who were there may have seen things differently. Okay? So there are lots. Carolyn wrote an excellent piece that's been cited many, many times on relational ethics. I highly recommend that piece. She doesn't come to any principled conclusions. She comes to conclusions about how difficult it is to come to conclusions, you know, and all the relational things, because you're connected. You're connected to other people who are in your stories. And, you know, that's pretty important stuff. But then, you know, you can also look at the whole history of like experimental social psychology, all the bad things that were done, you know, in the name of science, right? The authoritarian studies, Milgram studies. I don't know if any of you know the Milgram studies. I mean, you couldn't do those studies today. You know, and did the end justify the means? Tricking people, deceiving people in order to see how they would act. I was involved in one when I was a graduate student that was like horrifying. It was on the communication of bad news, you know. So they set up an experiment where people would come, you know, and a phone would ring in a professor's office that you were visiting, and someone would tell you that some family member of his had died, and you have to tell the news. And then later on you would debrief the subject and say, we were only kidding, you know. I mean, this is the stuff that was done, but I have grave reservations about institutional review boards, but they do have a place,
Yeah.
you know, right?
Oh, yeah.
Anything else?
I have time for one more question.
Okay, yes.
There's a lot of things you hit on that answered a lot of questions for me, so thank you.
Good.
A couple of things that I don't know if these are just statements or maybe there's questions in these statements, but
Doesn't need to be a question. You can just make a comment.
just addressing, when you're writing autoethnography, I'm working on my proposal, my dissertation. I can't say it's an autoethnography, but it's very based in my, things that happened to me. So when I'm writing and when I'm meeting with my advisor, I know she sometimes gets sick of me because I just, tears and stuff just come out. I'm not a crier person, so I'm not knowing, where is this coming from? Is it just like a form of healing and therapy when you're able to take something that happened to you out of you and face it?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also an element of stigma, for other people that are involved, like you're talking about other people who,
Mm-hmm.
would they agree with how they're being represented? In my specific story, I don't know where the people are, if they're still around. And the people that are still around that I could ask to participate, a lot of those people are still under stigma, even if they're not participating in the same activities. I'm talking about crack cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of pain that comes out from the time. There's stigma attached to it that makes me think, people are going to read this about me, and I'm going to forever be the crackhead, dissertation PhD person.
Yeah.
I also, there's a lot of things you have to wrestle with. I mean,
Absolutely.
when you're reading about something like a drug like that, you get a taste. Though you elicit things in your mind, that you make you feel like, wow, I sure wish I could do that again. I mean, I know I can't, but there's a lot of things that come up that I didn't realize. And it can also be depressing. I found myself sometimes saying, like, what the hell am I writing about this? It's just, the things that happened, the things I saw, the things I did. So there's some depression sometimes that comes up. And, yeah, so, I mean,
Well,
how are those things worked out?
You used the word healing in the first part of your response, and I do think that there is a healing aspect to this kind of work, and the drive toward it. I think he's still taping, and I think you should view what you just said. I don't know if anybody else taped it, but I think what you just said should be part of whatever you're writing. That you had these anxieties, that you had these concerns, that you have these, the